I'm Kirsten Newman, curator at the OI Museum, and I would like to welcome you to this evening's lecture, which is being offered in connection with our current special exhibition, Making Sense of Marbles, Roman Sculpture at the OI. This exhibition, which was co-curated by Rocco Rumora, PhD candidate in the Department of Art History, and myself, displays for the first time the OI's full Roman sculpture collection. If you have not already done so, you will have the opportunity to view the exhibit following tonight's talk, alongside joining us for a small wine reception in the Mesopotamian Gallery. Our talk this evening, however, will focus on a neighboring yet related collection, the Mediterranean sculpture at the Art Institute of Chicago. And this brings me to our speaker. It is with great pleasure to welcome as our speaker for this evening, a fellow curator at a Chicago museum, Dr. Katharine Raff, the Elizabeth McIlvaine Associate Curator of the Arts of the Ancient Mediterranean and Byzantium at the Art Institute of Chicago, where Katharine has worked since 2011. In this position, Katharine has played an integral role in such major projects as the comprehensive reinstallation of the Mary and Michael Jaharis Galleries of Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art in 2012, as well as exhibitions and installations, including a portrait of Antinous in 2 parts and collecting stories. She also edited and co-authored Roman Art at the Art Institute of Chicago, an interdisciplinary digital scholarly catalog that appeared in 2017. These projects reflect Katharine's primary research interests, which center on the arts of the Roman world, including in particular sculpture and the context in which such objects were made, used, and viewed over time. This connects nicely with her current occupation, specifically working with colleagues in her department of the Art Institute on a phased multi-year project to fully reinstall the Mary and Michael Jaharis Galleries of Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art by 2025, for which she has developed the plans and concept for the new Roman gallery. Tonight's talk, however, offers something of the reverse, a look back in time. And so I welcome Dr. Raff to the stage for her talk, From Plaster to Marble, the Evolution of Ancient Mediterranean Sculpture at the Art Institute of Chicago.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone at the OI Museum for the very kind invitation to speak to you this evening. I'm thrilled to be here to present to you on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, namely the history of the Art Institute's Ancient Mediterranean collection, and within that, the collection of Greek and especially Roman sculpture. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the critical work of Karen B. Alexander, a longtime supporter of the Art Institute of Chicago, and especially its Department of the Arts of the Ancient Mediterranean and Byzantium, both in its current form and in its earlier iterations. I'm truly indebted to Karen for the many years of dedicated and painstaking research she has conducted on the history of art department and its collection from the time of the museum's origins in the 19th century through the present, which you can read about in her article, From Plaster to Stone, which has been a critical source of information for my own work on the history of this area of the museum's collection, in addition to serving as the inspiration for the title of my talk this evening. Karen's article was featured in the Art Institute publication, Recasting the Past, published by former chair and curator of Ancient and Byzantine Art, Karen Manchester, on the occasion of the opening of the Mary and Michael Jaharis Galleries of Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art in 2012. It is for this reason that I would like to dedicate my talk tonight to Karen Alexander in gratitude for all that she has done to preserve and advance our knowledge of the Art Institute's Ancient Mediterranean collection. Shifting gears to the topic of the OI's current exhibition, Making Sense of Marbles, there is of course no question that the OI is world-renowned for its rich holdings related to the ancient Middle East and North Africa. Given this long-standing focus, I, and I imagine like many of you, was quite surprised to learn that the museum had a small but notable collection of examples of classical sculpture in its collection. Classical, of course, meaning arts of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. And to this end, I'm grateful to Dr. Kirsten Newman and doctoral candidate Rocco Rumora, co-curators of the current exhibition, for the incredible work that they put into examining this understudied area of the OI's collection and for bringing it to light for the museum's audiences with fresh, critical eyes. Moreover, in speaking with Kirsten before the exhibition opened, I was equally, if not more, surprised to learn of former OI director Carl Kraeling's ambitious and admirable goal of creating a, quote, representative collection of classical sculptures for the city of Chicago. This was a goal that Kraeling stated in 1957 after the second season of fieldwork at Ptolemais, and in fact, on the occasion of the opening of an exhibition of Roman sculpture that included most of the objects in the current show. Now, as a curator at the Art Institute, where I've worked since 2011, my knee-jerk reaction upon learning of Kraeling's goal was to ask, what was his motivation for this, given that the Art Institute has long been the home of Greek and Roman art in Chicago? And I imagine that many of you here in the audience tonight who are familiar with the Art Institute's Ancient Mediterranean collection and their current presentation in the Mary and Michael J. Harris galleries have similarly asked the same question. And so in my talk tonight, I intend to contextualize Kraeling's aspirations relative to what was happening up the street at the Art Institute at this same period in the 1950s. However, before we can consider this particular moment in the mid-20th century, I think it's important to set the stage by looking back even further to the late 19th century, the period in which the Art Institute, the OI, and many of the other cultural institutions of Chicago were founded. It is in this historical context that we encounter the two main factors that impacted the development of the Art Institute's collection of ancient Mediterranean art and its holdings in marble sculptures specifically. The first of which was the Art Institute's former collection of plaster casts of famed ancient sculptures, which were at the core of the nascent museum's collection in its first several decades. And the second of which was the triumvirate of early museum leaders, namely Charles L. Hutchinson, William M. R. French, and Martin A. Ryerson, and the emphasis that they placed on classical art, broadly defined to include casts, when building a fine arts collection for the city of Chicago. The 19th century was, of course, a critical period in Chicago's history. Incorporated in 1837, the city quickly grew and prospered thanks to the region's rich natural resources, as well as the growth of numerous commodities: grain, lumber, and pork, just to name a few. However, only a few decades later, in 1871, the city was all but destroyed in the Great Fire. In the years that followed, significant civic energies were dedicated to rebuilding the city, thanks in part to a nationwide wave of cultural philanthropy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which came in large part through the efforts of the progeny of many of the great commercial magnates of the Gilded Age. Born into wealth and high social standing, such individuals, who were primarily men, given the gendered constraints of the period, benefited from opportunities that many of their fathers were never afforded. This included higher education and increased travel, not only within the US, but especially in Europe. In the course of such trips, they experienced renowned cultural institutions such as museums, libraries, and symphonies, which, although already present on the East Coast, were still lacking here in the Midwest. And so as Chicago was rebuilt, a concerted effort was made to introduce such institutions into the city, and not just for those who could afford it, but for the good of all. The Art Institute had its origins in this critical period of rebuilding. Initially founded in 1879 as the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts, it was, by 1882, renamed the Art Institute of Chicago. Created as a school for teaching art, it soon took on a second role as a museum, dual functions that the Art Institute still maintains today. And here you see the Art Institute in the home it held for only several years, from 1887 to 1893, before it moved to its permanent home up the street, which was built specifically for the World's Columbian Exposition of 1892 to 93, and which became the museum's permanent home after the fair ended. Now, it's important to note that in the museum's early days, Chicago was one of only 4 American cities with a major art museum, the rest of which were on the East Coast, specifically Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Over the next several decades, other Midwestern cities would also become home to art museums of their own: Cleveland, Minneapolis, and St. Louis, for example. But it was the Art Institute that was to become not only the premier art museum of the Midwest, but in fact one of the biggest art museums in the country. Today, it is the second largest art museum in the United States, with a collection numbering over 300,000 works, encompassing the arts of antiquity to the present, or as we broadly like to describe it, covering 5,000 years of human creativity. Although, of course, I realize where I am right now in the OI, you cover 10,000 years of humanity, so we have a little bit of catching up to do. So turning to collections of ancient objects, Chicago is unique in having 3 major museums with such collections, all of which had their foundations in the late 19th century, namely the Art Institute, the Field Museum of Natural History, and the OI Museum. All 3 are clearly different types of museums with variations in their missions, collections, and audiences. But speaking in broad strokes, the Art Institute is an encyclopedic fine arts museum with a collection representing ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt, and comprising sculptures, vases, coins, glass, and mosaics, among other media. The Field Museum is, of course, a natural history museum, And while its ancient collection bears some overlap with that of the Art Institute, given its emphasis on Etruria, Rome, and Egypt, its collection has long placed a greater emphasis on the object's anthropological significance. And finally, the OI Museum is an archaeological museum set within a research institute at a major university, with a collection that is renowned for its extensive holdings pertaining to the archaeological, textual, linguistic, and historical record of the ancient Middle East and North Africa. And while these divisions seem clear to us today, they were not entirely straightforward in the late 19th century and were codified as the institutions and their collections developed over time. Moreover, beyond these three museums' shared interests in ancient cultures, they are also united in the fact that many of their founders and early leaders came from the same small pool of wealthy, civic-minded Chicagoans who supported multiple cultural and academic organizations, meaning that there was, in fact, quite a bit of cooperation across institutions, which even spilled over into the formation of their respective collections. The relationship of these three ancient collections in Chicago is a huge topic that merits an entire lecture in its own right, and is something I can't fully dive into tonight. But I call out these basic commonalities and differences here now, as for the purposes of my talk, I think it's important to recognize that from their very foundations, these museums and their collections developed in parallel and at times overlapping ways, helping to set the stage for former OI director Kraeling's ambitious goal in the 1950s to create a collection of classical sculptures for the city. And so while my talk tonight will be focusing on the development of the Art Institute's collection of Greek and Roman marble sculptures from its origins to the present, I will, where relevant, touch on the special relationship between the Art Institute and the University of Chicago, and with the OI specifically. So returning to the Art Institute in its early days, one cannot consider the formation of the classical collection without acknowledging the tremendous influence of the Art Institute's longest-serving president, Charles Lawrence Hutchinson. Described by former Art Institute and president and director Jim Cuno as, quote, arguably the single most important individual to have shaped the direction and fortunes of the Art Institute of Chicago, unquote, Hutchinson played a critical role in the museum's development in his 42-year-long tenure as its president. Born in 1854 as the eldest son of an ambitious and highly successful trader of grain and other commodities, Hutchinson was raised with the privileges that his father's fortune brought, although he by no means had his successes handed to him. After ascending rapidly in the banking industry, he became president of the Art Institute in 1882 at the age of only 28, a position he ultimately held until his death in 1924. Hutchinson has been described as the prime mover of the Art Institute, as he had a growing vision for the fledgling museum, which included the desire to make art available to all Chicagoans. As he once said, art is not destined for a small and privileged class. Art is democratic, it is of the people and for the people. Hutchinson's egalitarian mindset, coupled with his commitment to civic affairs and philanthropy, led him to support a range of organizations, from civic and municipal interests to other museums and academic institutions. For example, in 1890, he played a critical role in helping to found the University of Chicago, serving as one of its founding trustees and its first treasurer, roles that would establish the initial connection between the Art Institute and the local scholarly community at the nascent university. And in creating a museum for the people of Chicago, Hutchinson looked firmly to the belief that art must be based in tradition. In the late 19th century, the arts of the ancient Mediterranean world, specifically those of Greece and Rome, were widely viewed not only as the premier example of artistic achievement, but also as the paradigm from which Western art had evolved. Consequently, for Hutchinson and for other Art Institute founders, examples of Greek and Roman art were believed to be of great interest to both the general public and the students of the Fine Arts School. And thus, the Art Institute's collection began in part with ancient Mediterranean art, or more specifically, an approximation of it. In 1885, the museum made its first acquisition of classical material, specifically a set of plaster casts of Greek and Roman sculptures. And I just want to note now that unfortunately we don't have any photos of the casts in any of the earlier Art Institute buildings, so any cast images I'm showing you tonight will be from the cast galleries of the 1893 building. So the collection quickly expanded, and in 1887, the trustees received a gift of $7,000, which was equivalent to about $200,000 today, from Mrs. Addie Hall Ellis to build a comprehensive cast collection in honor of her late husband, Mr. Elbridge G. Hall. And this task was achieved in consultation with Mrs. Lucy Myers Wright Mitchell, one of the first American women to study classical archaeology and author of the monograph, A History of Ancient Sculpture. Covering ancient Egypt through the reign of Emperor Constantine, Mitchell's nearly 800-page long monograph was a groundbreaking publication that was incredibly well received in its day. Mitchell advised the Art Institute on its cast purchases, which were ordered from European manufacturers and were, according to the gift requirements, produced as full-size facsimiles of the original works, as you can see here. And so you can imagine just how much gallery space was needed to accommodate all of these casts. Still more casts entered the collection in 1889, and in this short period of time, the entire cast collection, which included examples representing the sculptures of Greece and Rome, along with Egypt and the ancient Middle East, as well as casts of later French and other European sculptures, came to number over 400 examples at that early date. They were installed on the first floor of the museum's home at that time on Michigan Avenue and Van Buren Street, as seen in my earlier slide. But as we'll see, they would come to play an increasingly prominent role in the museum's future home up the street. The cast collection was, of course, frequently used by students of the art school to practice drawing from the antique, and additionally, it allowed for the study of the nude human form without actual nude models. And this is something that seems to have been a concern during this period, especially for mixed gender art classes. However, the museum's founders also felt that casts had an educational benefit for the public. Specifically, they could provide local audiences with the opportunity to experience the artistic achievements of the ancient Mediterranean world here in the city, the kinds of things that many of the museum's wealthy trustees had seen firsthand on their own European travels, but which the majority of Chicagoans would never realistically experience in person. Moreover, the casts were also thought to help elevate public taste while also lifting the spirits and behavior of viewers, a concept similarly promoted in other art museums of the period. And to facilitate students and museum visitors' viewing of the casts, a copy of Lucy Mitchell's monograph was made accessible in the galleries, while another copy entered the collection of the museum's newly formed library. Over the next several decades, the museum continued to amass a significant collection of casts, in fact, one of the largest in the United States, comprising hundreds of examples of renowned ancient sculptures. For example, the collection was largely formed by casts of classical Greek works from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, as well as casts of renowned Hellenistic sculptures, and casts of famed Roman works. And in addition to the plaster cast, the collection expanded to include bronze reproductions of ancient artworks, including examples discovered in Pompeii and Herculaneum, as well as plaster casts painted to look as if they were bronze. And as I noted earlier, the cast collection wasn't limited to classical marbles, as we also had a sizable collection of casts of sculptures from ancient Egypt and the ancient Middle East, as you can see here. And I especially love this photo with the woman boy in their period clothing because it really gives a sense of the scale and in some instances, the monumentality of these casts. And to be sure, Hutchinson, along with the Art Institute's first director, William M.R. French, who himself was also the director of the School of the Art Institute, had recognized early on that casts only fulfilled a part of the museum's aims and its public mission. And to this end, they set out on the Art Institute's initial foray into collecting actual ancient artworks. In 1889, they made the museum's first purchase of ancient objects in the form of a group of 186 Greek terracotta statuettes and fragments of statuettes. It's a lot of heads like what you see on the right, as well as over 600 coins, all of which were sold by Francis H. Bacon of Boston. Hutchinson and French, in a show of continued interest in growing the institution as a whole, then set off in the spring of 1889 on a trip to Europe, not only to purchase artworks, but also to educate themselves on approaches to museum display. On this initial trip, they not only purchased more casts, but with the help of Italian archaeologist Rodolfo Lanciani, a name undoubtedly familiar to many of you, along with antiquities dealers recommended by Lanciani, they acquired a number of Greek vases, as well as a few Roman marbles, such as the examples you see here. This early emphasis on vases and sculptures, the former specifically for their figural paintings, exemplified the centuries-old tradition in Western art of privileging sculpture and painting as the quote-unquote high arts, as opposed to the minor or decorative arts, meaning objects that served a functional purpose. This prioritization of paintings and sculpture impacted the formation of other areas of the museum's collection in its early days, during which time the emphasis was especially on collecting paintings, particularly from European artists. And due to the fact that the museum had invested so heavily in plaster casts in its first few years, Hutchinson and French focused their efforts primarily on acquiring more vases, including Attic vases from the 6th to 5th centuries BCE, South Italian vases from the 4th to 3rd centuries BCE, and even some Etruscan bucero. From a practical standpoint, the examples of pottery were smaller, lighter weight, and didn't have the potential for duplicating sculptural types already represented in the cast collection. And overall, this initial trip promoted the Art Institute's early commitment to ancient art, particularly on the part of Hutchinson, who, in that same year, went on to co-found the Chicago chapter of the Archaeological Institute of America. And so by 1889, by the end of that year, the Art Institute had a classical collection numbering around 900 objects. The majority of those were from the initial Francis Bacon purchase, while the remainder were formed by close to 40 examples of Greek pottery, along with other odds and ends. For example, a couple of segments of lead pipe. Marbles, however, were particularly scant, with only 7 examples recorded as entering the collection in 1889, and all in a fragmentary state. Capitalizing on this collection-building momentum, in 1889, the museum also published its first catalog, which included objects from the classical collection. 79 of such works were included, but as you can see here from the image on the right, the focus was very much on the vases, which were listed first. The few marbles in the collection were near the end of the section on antiquities, with some basic information beyond the object titles. And I particularly like this one right here. For example, we have a head of a woman identified as Faustina the Elder, the quote-unquote unworthy wife of Antoninus Pius, no doubt reflecting the ongoing influence of ancient Roman literary sources and their frequent efforts to paint negative pictures of the women of the Roman imperial family. Of course, I will say this is not how we would describe this esteemed Roman matron today. Now, after the foundational year that was 1889, Hutchinson would embark on future buying tours with another trusted colleague, Martin A. Ryerson. Born into a prosperous lumber manufacturing family, Ryerson built on his family's successes to become the wealthiest man in Chicago by the age of only 36. After being named a trustee at the Art Institute, he would eventually become its vice president. And through his close relationship with Hutchinson, and the two were even described as a committee of two, he would similarly play a critical role in the museum's development in its early years. And just to point out the close ties between many of Chicago's institutions at this time, Ryerson also served as vice president of the Field Museum, was a trustee at the University of Chicago, and served as president of its board of trustees. And over the course of nearly 25 years, Hutchinson and Ryerson, along with their wives, would embark on scouting trips around the world. In addition to 3 trips to Egypt, which are said to have reignited Hutchinson's childhood interest in antiquity, they also frequently traveled to Europe, where they would visit all of the local cultural landmarks and museums, learning what they could to enhance the displays at the Art Institute while seeking to expand the collection further. The acquisitions made on these trips for the classical collection continued to focus on Greek vases and terracotta statuettes, and efforts were also made to begin building a collection of ancient glass. However, little attention was paid to acquiring additional Greek and Roman marble sculptures, given the already significant investment in the cast collection, which would continue to grow in the early years of the 20th century. And now, while Hutchinson, French, and Ryerson had been doing the bulk of the actual collection building in these early years, they also recognized the need for a dedicated curator with a scholarly background in Greek and Roman art to oversee the physical collection itself, a position that hadn't yet existed at the museum. And I just want to say, too, that it's important to recognize that the concept of a museum professional as we know it today, whether providing for curatorial, administrative, financial oversight, or any other roles, hadn't yet emerged in these days. And rather the sort of informal leadership structure that existed at the Art Institute was very much a product of this period, when social, cultural, and financial affairs were all connected for wealthy elites such as these 3 men. That said, in 1890, the museum hired Alfred Emerson, a German-trained archaeologist and professor of classics at what was then Lake Forest University, now Lake Forest College, and he was hired as its curator of classical antiquities. Emerson focused his efforts primarily on the plaster cast collection rather than actual ancient artworks, with an eye toward classifying, cataloging, and publishing the casts. And I'm just going to say, I, for the life of me, cannot find an image of Alfred Emerson anywhere. So if any of you know where I can find one, please let me know. Hopefully there's one somewhere, so this is hence this slide. In fact, by 1891, the museum had published a catalog of the cast collection, based heavily on recent scholarly sources on ancient sculpture, including the aforementioned monograph by Lucy Mitchell. The Art Institute's new catalog offered detailed information about the original ancient sculptures on which the casts were based. And no sooner had Emerson joined the staff as curator of classical antiquities did he resign to teach at Cornell University. This left the department without a dedicated curator, a problem that would continue to plague the department in the decades to come, although Emerson would continue to serve as an advisor to the museum for many years moving forward. Arguably, Emerson's most important contribution to the Art Institute in this phase pertained to the collection of casts and, to a lesser extent, to the collection of actual marble sculptures. In 1892, he brought to Chicago the Polychrome Exhibition, which was initially organized by the Museum of Fine Arts Boston in 1891. Above all, the Chicago Polychrome Exhibition was intended as an experiment that attempted to reconstruct the colorful and vibrant appearances of sculptures and architecture from the ancient Mediterranean world. Among the more than 50 objects included in the Chicago exhibition, and I should note that there are no photos of it, unfortunately, many were plaster casts that had been polychromed, which were either colored or bronzed using materials including chalk, pastels, and wax. And in an effort to highlight actual ancient sculptures, the exhibition also included a small number of artworks from the Art Institute's collection that preserve traces of color, such as this lion's head on the left, as well as several ancient Roman marbles, including the head of a Silenus on the right, which, according to the catalog, were temporarily colored in pastels. Now, several years later, in 1895, the Art Institute hired a new curator of the classical collection, Frank Bigelow Tarbell, a name that may be familiar to many of you here at the University of Chicago. Tarbell seems to have worked for the Art Institute in a part-time capacity, as he was also on the faculty here at the university. He was initially hired as an associate professor of Greek language and literature before quickly advocating for an autonomous Department of Archaeology, which would later become the Department of Art History. Tarbell's dual position as professor and curator reflected the increasingly close-knit relationships between the two institutions. In fact, in an 1895 letter written by Art Institute Director French to University of Chicago President William Rainey Harper, French identified Tarbell as, quote, the chief connecting line, unquote, between the university and the museum. Tarbell had a special interest in attic pottery, something that permeated his work in both spheres. At the Art Institute, he worked to rearrange the display of attic vases, and much like his predecessor, Alfred Emerson, he worked to increase the size of the plaster cast collection. So, more casts. And in fact, this area of the collection would grow to fill nearly the entire main floor of the museum itself, which was now housed in the 1893 building, as you can see on this floor plan from 1895. And so just to kind of talk you through what we've got here. So the main floor is at the bottom, and the second floor is at the top. And actually the parts that are sort of kind of thinner, kind of grayish lines are actually not even built yet. These are sort of aspirational at this point. And so here, starting at the top, on the second floor in green, we have Egyptian and Greek antiquities, or at least that's how they're identified in the catalog. There's no actual mention of Roman antiquities. And then everything else marked here are cast galleries. So in yellow, we have the bronze cast galleries. And then going to the main floor, in purple, we have Egyptian and Assyrian casts. In blue, we have Greek casts, which filled up 3 galleries. In red, we have Roman casts. And of course, pink is the modern cast, so again, French and other European casts. Now, it's unclear when Tarbell relinquished his responsibilities as curator to fully devote his time to teaching, but by 1905, former curator Alfred Emerson had returned, diving right back into the cast collection, focusing specifically on its physical care and its publication. And to this end, Emerson completed a 2-volume work, as you see here. Although it briefly treated some of the Egyptian antiquities in the collection, it was essentially a much longer, more detailed version of the earlier cast catalog, with a particular focus on Greek casts. And so by this period, the cast truly took up the lion's share of the gallery space, with actual antiquities, including Egyptian artworks, still relegated to a small single gallery, now on the main floor, and again here in green. While Emerson's catalog functioned as a textbook on the Greek sculptures, it offered no discussion of Hellenistic or Roman sculpture. And even if such a volume had been planned, it would never come to fruition, as a number of major changes happened in the 19-teens that would affect the future of the classical art department and its collection for decades to come. First, Emerson resigned from his curatorial post in 1916, again, after which he was not replaced with a new curator. This effectively ended what was then the classical art department's existence as an autonomous department overseen by a specialist in the field, something that would not be permanently rectified for many years. And for roughly the next 6 decades, and yes, that's right, 6 decades, any curatorial work related to the ancient collection was typically parceled out to other loosely related departments to which it served as adjunct, including those formerly known as Oriental art, paintings and drawings, earlier paintings, and European decorative arts. And around the time of Emerson's departure, the collection numbered around 1,100 classical objects in total. Significantly, only about 20 of those were Greek and Roman marbles. And of those 20, a little more than half were sculptures or fragments of sculptures, while the rest were architectural fragments. In contrast, the collection included over 500 full-scale casts of Greek and Roman sculptures alone, which continued to take up most of the main floor of the ever-expanding museum. And looking at a floor plan from around the same time, you can see how the museum was already expanding. And of course, here we see the entire main floor, but with a zoomed-in view, we can see at this point that classical, so specifically Greek antiquities and Egyptian antiquities, are still on display but placed in separate galleries in green and orange respectively. And although they now took pride of place near the entrance to the museum, this was not to last in the near future. A 1917 catalog of the Art Institute's collection, so something produced right after Emerson's departure, reinforces this continued emphasis on the cast collection. The casts are the first objects to appear in the catalog, with each cast individually named and described, as seen in the page at left. And in contrast, the entire classical antiquities collection is summarized in the excerpt on the right in 3 short paragraphs, without any discussion of specific objects. Rather, visitors were directed to the galleries for more information, such as the section ends with the statement, "For further identification, see labels." And so, to summarize, the collection of classical sculpture that the Art Institute had acquired in its first several decades, and by this I mean both actual ancient artworks and plaster casts, was formed almost entirely by the latter. And although efforts were still being made to build other areas of the classical collection, attention clearly was not being paid to making purchases or securing gifts of marble sculptures that could potentially have helped to contextualize the hundreds of casts on display. In contrast, many of our peer institutions, such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston on the East Coast, and others in the Midwest, such as the Cleveland Museum of Art, were actively building their collections of Greek and especially Roman sculpture in the 19 teens and 20s, both through purchases and gifts, while such works were still available on the market. And so you might be asking why this wasn't the case at the Art Institute. Well, the 19 teens also saw a number of other formative changes for the museum. Specifically, the period was marked by the deaths of the key figures who prioritized classical art, including director William French in 1914, President Charles Hutchinson a decade later in 1924, and finally trustee Martin Ryerson in 1932. But more broadly, priorities at the Art Institute had changed, as artworks representing other historical periods, cultures, and geographies were continuing to gain in popularity and became an increasing priority for the museum, which is in fact something we see happening even before the deaths of the aforementioned museum leaders. And to give just one example, in 1913, the Art Institute hosted the Armory Show from New York, which featured avant-garde works by European and American modernists, such as Picasso, Brancusi, and Matisse, among others. Although highly controversial at the time, and in fact, students of the School of the Art Institute even staged a protest against its display, it was later hailed for its progressivism, foreshadowing both the Art Institute's future role as a leader in the field of modern and contemporary art and its long-standing commitment to representing the art of all periods, including the present. Now, I don't mean to make all of this sound so gloom and doom for the classical collection as a whole, as there were glimmers of support for the department in the 19 teens and 20s, including sizable gifts to the coin collection, as well as the creation of several purchase funds, one of which was dedicated specifically to the acquisition of ancient sculptures. And despite the lack of a dedicated curator, the marble collection actually saw some growth in the 1920s. 9 marbles entered the collection at this time, almost entirely as gifts, and many of these are among the highlights of the collection today, including the fragment of a portrait head of Antinous at left, which in fact had belonged to Hutchinson's personal collection since the 1890s and was gifted to the museum by his widow, the Roman relief of a falling warrior at center, which represents a figure thought to originally have been depicted centuries earlier on the shield of the classical Greek cult statue of Athena Parthenos in the Parthenon, and finally a fragment of a Greek funerary Naiskos at right. This last object, acquired in 1928, was the museum's first large-scale acquisition of a classical marble and remains the largest ancient Greek marble in the collection. By the 1930s, however, the classical art department had officially entered what was to be a very long fallow period that would last for roughly half a century, during which time it was without a dedicated curator. Interest in the cast collection had swiftly begun to wane in the intervening decades, and not just at the Art Institute, but at other major art museums as well. Around this time, casts had begun to be seen as second-rate imitations of actual ancient artworks, which were thought to possess a purer and truer beauty and were therefore more deserving of display within a fine arts museum. It is at this point that the Art Institute's casts start to be removed from the galleries and eventually from the collection itself. For example, in the 1935 guide to the collection, the ancient sculptural casts aren't even mentioned, nor do they appear on the floor plan. And here you can see a detail of the floor plan. And in fact, the only remaining casts appear to be the architectural casts found in Blackstone Hall, which are here in pink. And there, that gallery still contained a few casts of casts of ancient architectural elements. Classical and Egyptian antiquities were still found near the entrance to the museum, albeit temporarily. In the years that followed, we find a similar situation, again with no sculptural casts, but with a new gallery to house the Robinson Ancient Glass Collection, here in blue. We also find the notable absence of Egyptian art, part of which was moved to the basement, with the rest being placed on indefinite loan to the OI in 1941 and 1949, respectively. And eventually, the classical antiquities and glass galleries were constricted even more. And just to really drive this point home, it's quite telling when we look at these galleries and the limited space they fill on the floor plan of the entire museum at that time. After 1956, Blackstone Hall with the architectural casts, again here in pink, was renovated for use by the department then known as Oriental Art. At this point, nearly all of the remaining casts were given away, sold off, or destroyed. The only plaster casts from this original group that still remain today are the replicas of a portion of the Parthenon frieze, which are currently on display of the second floor of the museum at the top of the women's board staircase. And if you look at the Hartwell Memorial Tiffany window, they are just to the left. And due to their proximity to this spectacular recent acquisition, I am hoping that they are actually gaining the attention of more visitors than ever before. And thus, by the mid-20th century, interest in the classical collection had dwindled considerably, although it never entirely died out. And returning to the marble sculptures specifically, the collection experienced something of a resurgence beginning in the 1960s, when 2 Greek sculptures from funerary monuments entered the collection, along with 3 Roman sculptures, a fountain spout and 2 portrait heads. Written correspondence pertaining to one of these objects, the female portrait head on the right, reinforces that the idea that there was scholarly awareness that the museum's collection was lacking in this area but could be improved. In a 1960 letter written by Museum of Fine Arts Boston curator Cornelius C. Vermeule to then director of the Art Institute, John Maxson, Vermeule stated, "John, if you go on finding and considering works such as this, you are going to have the most wonderful renaissance of classical art in Chicago imaginable." And then in the decades that followed, that growth occurred, albeit at a slow and cautious pace. From 1970 until 2009, so for the next 4 decades, 15 examples of Greek and Roman marbles entered the collection. And I should note that 2009 was when the last marble acquisition occurred, which is this fragment of funerary Lekithos on the right. In fact, it wasn't even until 1972 when the museum acquired its first full-scale marble figure, seen here at left, which is an over-life-size Roman statue of the Greek hero Meleager, which I think, again, is quite interesting when we consider that literally hundreds of life-size or larger casts were on display in the museum in its early decades. Such a gap in the collection likely just didn't seem significant during that time period, given the focus on the casts. And again, this slow growth was due in part to the ongoing challenge provided or presented by the lack of a dedicated curator. We did not actually have a curator overseeing the collection until the 1970s. And also the fact that the curatorial department itself remained for many years an add-on to other larger departments with other priorities. In fact, our department, now known as Arts of the Ancient Mediterranean and Byzantium, did not become an independent curatorial department again until October of 2010, so just over 12 years ago. And this was thanks to a generous gift from the Jaharis Family Foundation. This gift also provided for expanded gallery space for Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art, offering a visible sign of the Art Institute's commitment to displaying and presenting the arts of the ancient Mediterranean world for the museum's diverse audiences for years to come. And of course, beyond these internal considerations, the legal and ethical guidelines surrounding the acquisition of ancient artworks have evolved considerably in the last 50 or so years, beginning with the guidelines set out in 1970 by UNESCO and its Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property, which are at the core of the professional standards to which the professional standards to which our current acquisition guidelines adhere today. And so as we've traced the development of the Art Institute's collection of Greek and Roman marbles over more than a century, I think we can return to the question I posed at the beginning of my talk, specifically with regard to former OI director Kraeling's motivations to build a collection of classical sculptures for the city of Chicago in the 1950s. Based on the overview I've just provided, I think it's safe to say 2 things. First, that there was a recognition in the mid-20th century, at least in scholarly circles, that the Art Institute did not have a comprehensive collection of Greek and Roman artworks, let alone a representative collection of marbles, and that on some level, this issue needed to be rectified. And second, that Kraeling was incredibly forward-thinking in recognizing at this period what a tremendous opportunity the expedition to ancient Ptolemais presented in terms of building a collection of classical marbles for the OI's collection, and in turn for Chicago more broadly. This was in large part due to the agreement by Libya to grant objects to the OI through the legal system of partage, or the division of fines. While partage was largely practiced in the Middle East in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was much less common by the mid-20th century, making the Ptolemais excavations a rare opportunity to acquire excavated ancient marbles at this later date. Now, Kraeling was, of course, successful in building a small collection of marbles of Roman imperial date, mainly through the excavations at Ptolemais, but also through purchases made on the art market. Did he achieve his goal of building a representative collection? In the true sense of the word representative, then one could argue that perhaps no, he did not, but in the 1950s, at a time when classical art had fallen out of favor in some circles, the very fact that Kraeling was able to build a small collection of Roman sculptures for the OI's collection, primarily through archaeological excavation, is in and of itself remarkable. In the current exhibition of these marbles, one of the key points is the importance of archaeological context in telling an object's story. And further to this, when we are lacking this type of information, that we as scholars must instead turn to other forms of investigation to understand an object's history, including art historical, technical, and provenance research. Building on this, a second key point of the exhibition is the importance of revisiting objects in museum and archival collections with fresh eyes, with new questions and technologies, and with, as Kirsten Newman so thoughtfully phrased it in her section of the exhibition talk in October, quote, with the increased knowledge that comes with the passing of time, unquote. As we consider the Art Institute's collection of Greek and Roman marble sculptures, and really its ancient Mediterranean collection as a whole, it's important to recognize that from the museum's very foundations, such works have largely been acquired on the market or through gifts, given that direct involvement in archaeological excavations was not and has never been at the core of our mission as a public encyclopedic art museum, and you can find our current mission statement here. Now, while there is no question that it would absolutely be beneficial to our knowledge and interpretation of these objects if there was documentation that they had been discovered through scientifically controlled archaeological excavations, and of course, even the phrase archaeological excavations can mean different things depending on when and where an object was uncovered, the fact is that this is ultimately the nature of the collection that we've inherited. That is, that it is one formed by works acquired largely on the market, and for which we now serve as stewards. And to this end, I couldn't agree more that revisiting a museum's collection over time and approaching it with new knowledge, with a more critical scholarly apparatus, and with current interdisciplinary methodologies helps us to explore and better present to our visitors aspects of an object's biography, and moreover, to find new ways to bring this information to bear on the presentation and interpretation of these objects for our audiences, both in the galleries and online. And building on this idea, to conclude my talk this evening, I'd like to give one brief example of how we have recently carried out this type of collaborative interdisciplinary research at the Art Institute, here with this Roman portrait head of a woman. I will give the caveat that this case study is an especially remarkable one, in which the stars very much aligned on all avenues of research. Of course, this isn't how it always happens, but it's exceptional when it does. This portrait had entered the museum's collection in 1962, and up until roughly the last decade or so, it had received very little scholarly attention. Previously thought to be a possible portrait of Sabina, wife of Emperor Hadrian, based on stylistic similarities to Sabina's established portrait types, this portrait head was one that had always cried out, or at least to me, as requiring a full scholarly overhaul. And so I was fortunate to have the opportunity to do so as part of my work as editor and co-author of a major digital scholarly catalog of the museum's ancient Roman collection, as you see here, titled Roman Art at the Art Institute of Chicago. Published in 2017, after more than 4 years of rigorous art historical, technical, and scientific research, this catalog, which is available online and is free to the public, remains the most extensive investigation to date of an area of the Art Institute's Ancient Mediterranean collection, featuring 165 objects, many of which had never been published at length, if at all. And relevant to the topic at hand, it pays particular attention to the collection of marble sculptures. Through the interdisciplinary research carried out for this publication, we were able to uncover entirely new storytelling possibilities for many objects, in some instances with regard to both their ancient and modern afterlives, while also opening up new avenues of research for future investigation. Working closely with Rachel Sabino, now Director of Objects and Textiles Conservation at the Art Institute, this portrait had proved to be one of the most challenging and also rewarding objects under examination. Art historical and technical research came together to shed light on aspects of its ancient history, as our examination revealed that it was partially recarved in antiquity. More specifically, while the subject's face was left untouched, she was given a new hairstyle, as evidenced by the partial remains of elements of the previous hairstyle at the sides and in the back. This likely occurred in the decades following its initial carving, and possibly upon the subject's death, and perhaps in an effort to recast the likeness as a funerary portrait, which is a practice that is known to have occurred with other recarved female portraits of this period. technical examination of the material evidence of the reworked marble, as well as that of the remains of a massive cramp at the back of the head. So basically this would be a giant sort of staple-like element that went into the vertical channel and socket that you can see there, would have been used to attach a new hairstyle. And this research was carried out alongside an art historical investigation of the potential hairstyles that could have been added at a later date. As a result, we were able to make a case for two possible hairstyles, either a quote-unquote tower coiffure, not unlike that worn by imperial women such as Faustina the Elder at center, and at the right you see an especially elevated example of this type of hairstyle. In either of these cases, a cramp would have supported the sort of vertical upthrust of the hairstyle, or as I would argue more likely, it could have been a thick, heavy bun with a cap of waves covering the back of the head, here with the cramp used to support the mass of the bun. The latter was used in some theomorphic portraits depicting women in the guise of Venus, Roman goddess of love and sexuality. Such assimilations are known to have occurred more often in funerary settings, where the subject's positive personal qualities could appropriately be compared to the virtues of the deity. And while the technical and art historical investigations shed considerable light on elements of the portrait head's ancient past, in-depth provenance research helped us learn more about the modern history of the object prior to entering the Art Institute's collection. Careful rereading of a passing note in the object file yielded a clue that helped us connect it back to the collection of Alfred Moritz Mond, 1st Baron Melchett, in London in 1913. Specifically, the head was illustrated in a 1928 catalog of the Melchett collection, although with restorations to the nose and the neck, which were removed before it ever came to the museum, but which gave it an appearance somewhat different from that of today. Moreover, in identifying the portrait's former ownership by Baron Melchett, we were able to determine that it had been given to him by Henrietta Hertz, a German-born philanthropist and art collector who helped found the Bibliotheca Hertziana in Rome in the early 20th century, and whose salons were celebrated as being at the center of modern Roman cosmopolitan life at that time. And so on the portrait head's object page on our website, you can find a link to the Roman catalog at right, where much of this research is published. And then just spilling over onto a second slide here, you can find its publication history, exhibition history, and all of the provenance as well. And again, using this project as a springboard for future research, at some point we hope to see if we can determine where Henrietta Hertz acquired the portrait head. But of course, as any of you who have ever carried out in-depth provenance research are aware, such research is time-consuming, seemingly perpetually ongoing, and therefore almost never complete. But that will not stop us from trying. And on a provenance-related note, I am happy to report as well that staff in Arts of the Ancient Mediterranean and Byzantium have actively been working for a number of years now to make provenance information available online for our department's entire collection. And we're making good progress at this and are aiming to have it all on the web in the near future. And with that brief overview of just one object, I hope to have demonstrated that there are still many stories we can tell about the works in our collection, both about their ancient and modern histories, and that a multi-pronged interdisciplinary approach incorporating art historical, technical, and provenance research can help us immensely in our storytelling efforts, both in the galleries and online. And sometimes the light we shed on these objects brings attention to them in other ways. For example, recently while walking through the galleries, I was pleasantly surprised to find this portrait on the cover of one of the museum's current floor plans, which often feature highlights of the collection, and so it's amazing to see her finally get her day in the sun. And so, to conclude, in working with collections of ancient objects, while we likely won't ever have all of the answers about each and every one of them, we are, as the title of the OI's current exhibition aptly puts it, always doing our best to make sense of them, with the goal of enriching their presentation and interpretation for the general public and scholarly audiences alike, while also opening up new avenues of research for future exploration. Thank you.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.